slavery, we saw that state-sanctioned practices geared toward black subjugation. That is, the racialized surveillance in public and private realms, arbitrary separation from family and kin relationships, vulnerability to arbitrary physical punishment and violence, captivity and premature death can still be seen in municipal, provincial, and national policing agencies, jails, prisons, child welfare agencies, border regulation, social services, customs agents. Now, of course, we can speak of anti-black racism as a much more broad phenomenon, as we should. We know, for example, that these new viral videos of random white community members calling the police on other black people, right? So we know that racialized surveillance and punishment is something that extends well into the rest of our society, that there's a broader complicity. But it's important for us to look at the state, I think, because as the legislator of the good and for the will of the people, and the holder of the law of what is right and just and equal, supposedly, in this country, for those to be the same sources of harm against black communities says something very particular about what we are up against. I'm going to continue speaking about the importance of consciousness, because how we conceive of racial injustice is going to be integral as to how we will be able to fight it. So that brings us to, I think, some of the more transformative potential of, to paraphrase, if black women could be free, then all of us could be free, which is me just reducing the essence a little bit more of the Combahee River collective statement. There exists today a very important gendered hierarchy of outrage in terms of what kinds of violence, what kinds of policing, what kinds of racism that we can see, that we focus on, that have become central to, I think, our movement, central to even our emotive response to things that occur. This isn't a level of perception, but it's very real still. I think that Black Lives Matter is seen, though it's not doing this, but Black Lives Matter is seen as something that is about police shootings of black men. Me Too is seen as something that is just about the realities of white women. Now, the fact that the founder of Me Too originally was a black woman, the fact that Black Lives Matter is both led by women and fights for black women is real, but is erased within the public perception of these facts. And that's very much part of the ways that we know that race and gender continue to not be seen as coexisting, even though we are now 40 years after this statement by the Combahee River Collective. The racial and gendered hierarchy of outrage demands that we expand our frame of analysis and that we expand the terrain of freedom that we are actually fighting for. So, if we think about something like the Starbucks incident, this is important. We have similar incidents in Canada. I think it's important as we sort of canonize the Starbucks incident that Abdirahman Abdi was killed in a cafe in which the police were called because he was supposedly harassing a white woman but was then beaten to death by a police officer, right? So that we have our own incidents here. But the Starbucks incident is one that canonized it, so I'm going to sort of use this as a way of thinking about, one way of thinking about the policing of black life. Now, this incident sparked important discussions about the ongoing reality that black life continues to be criminalized in public spaces. Of course, the mandatory bias training that was promised and probably delivered by Starbucks will probably have very little impact besides salvaging PR. I think it's important that this did generate really valuable discussions about the still living legacy of slavery in North America, of black people's inability to move freely in the public realm. This incident, of course, is only one of others. We know that driving while black has been documented, in Ottawa, Kingston, Ontario, that racial profiling more broadly is something that exists in every Canadian city where it has been measured, whether in the United States, whether it's called stop and frisk or whether it's called carding or street checks in Canada. This is an important site of policing and of racialized violence, and it's one that's often represented as existing, as targeting black men, black males. And while this is something that's very central to our struggle, and this is something that we really need to address fundamentally if we're going to create broader liberatory movements, it's important for us to expand the ways that we actually view policing and police violence. Now, of course, you can trace the genealogy of this kind of policing, this kind of public policing back to, and is often traced back to the slave patrols, right? This is often the way we think about the genealogy of racialized surveillance. And it's a really important one, where, for example, in Canada, in 1789, a bill was passed in Nova Scotia to restrict the free movement of blacks, and black people who were deemed disorderly could face 7 years of indentureship. So So this is very real, right? This is very much a part of our collective history, that after abolition, black men were targeted in specific ways, seen as sexual threats to white women, including a statement by John A. MacDonald that he was actually arguing for the need to maintain the death penalty because of, I quote, the frequency of rape committed by Negroes. There was a near lynching of a black man in Alberta in 1911 when he was falsely accused of assaulting a white teenage girl. We know that black people continue to be policed in this way, and that's why it's important for us to rescue, I think, this genealogy. But I think there have been very important feminist interventions into the notion that this is the primary and only source of policing and of racialized harm that black communities experience. And I think that if we look to different genealogies, we see different ways that profiling and surveillance and racialized discipline continue to go on unseen. Hortense Spillers talks about the ungendering of black women. And I think that's something that speaks very well to the lack of protections afforded both rhetorically and actually to black women as compared to white women, who were, of course, the ones that were figured as actually women, right? So many historians, Sarah Haley, Angela Davis, Andrea Ritchie, have also pointed to the fact that black women were seen as sexually degenerate while subjected to all kinds of physical brutalities just as much as males were, right? So this idea that it was only the male black men that were being subject to violence is already one that is a myth and one that's important to go against. Charmaine Nelson talks about how the surveillance of black women in public and private spaces was part of slavery, and that black women were seen as fair game for sexual violence, as possible runaways, as criminals. A black girl named Sarah Wood was convicted in 1789 for stealing condiments and whipped 39 times in a public setting in Nova Scotia. So this idea that somehow the slave patrols tracing the black male into the carting of the young black man in the present day is something that is already erasing the realities of black women as also being already subject to these same kinds of harm. But we can actually also see different iterations of this, right? If we look at the ways that black women's sexuality has been criminalized, Canada's history of criminalizing prostitution has targeted black women since its inception. If you look to the arrest records for prostitution offenses in the late 19th and early 20th century, you see that in Vancouver, in Hamilton, and Toronto, that in Vancouver, for example, almost 30% of arrests for morality charges were black women, which is major if you think about what the black population of Vancouver was at that time. In 1873, black women in Halifax were 3% of the population, but 40% of vagrancy charges. So this idea that black men cannot move freely through public space, but black women have been exempt from that, is something that is a very important myth that we need to deconstruct. And this is something that persists into the present, particularly for trans black women who are targeted by the police for loitering, for sex work-related charges. In my book, I talk to the stories that I will not recreate here of Audrey Smith, Stacey Bonds, Majisa Phillips, all brutalized by the police in public spaces, as black activists like the Black Action Defense Committee, for example, in the 1980s have been addressing, even if it's gone sort of unseen out of the public eye.